strange moment happening in Washington right now, one that doesn't fit the usual script. Two of the most powerful labor unions in the United States, organizations that have spent decades fighting for tariffs, not against them, are now urging the Trump administration to pull back on a massive new round of trade penalties aimed at one of America's closest allies. The presidents of the United Steelworkers, USW, and the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers, IAM, have sent a joint letter to US Trade Representative Jameson Greer, asking him to reconsider a looming wave of 50% tariffs on Canadian goods. If nothing changes, those tariffs are scheduled to hit on August 19th, and unlike most of Trump's other tariff actions, this one comes with no carve-outs. Goods that are fully compliant with the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, the very trade deal Trump himself negotiated during his first term, would not be spared. For two unions that represent well over 1 million workers combined, publicly pushing back against tariffs is not something that happens lightly. It signals just how unusual and potentially damaging this particular round of trade action is seen to be, even among groups that have historically been some of Trump's most reliable allies on trade policy, a letter that reads like a warning. In their letter, USW International President Roxanne Brown and IAM International President Brian Bryant didn't mince words. Their core argument is that Canada has never been the source of the problems American workers have faced from decades of loose trade policy. While they acknowledge that American workers and their communities have genuinely suffered under various free trade arrangements over the years, they insist Canada isn't the country responsible for that pain. The two union leaders point to something bigger than trade numbers, a decades-long relationship between the US and Canada that goes far beyond commerce. They highlight the deep economic integration between the two countries, along with intelligence sharing and defense cooperation that has bound the nations together for generations. In their view, slapping a blanket 50% tariff on Canadian goods with no exceptions, even for products that meet the standards of an agreement Washington itself signed, risks unraveling all of that for very little strategic benefit. Rather than reaching for new tariffs under Section 338 of the Tariff Act or any similar mechanism, the unions are proposing something different. Sit down with Canadian counterparts and work together to crack down on the specific bad actors and unfair trade practices that actually hurt American workers, instead of penalising an ally broadly. They frame this as a matter of priorities, essentially arguing that Washington's energy would be better spent confronting countries like China, which they see as the real source of unfair trade competition, rather than driving a deeper wedge between the US and Canada. Notably, the unions aren't rejecting tariffs as a tool altogether. Both organizations have supported several of the administration's other trade actions in the past, and they say they remain committed to moving away from what they call outdated free trade orthodoxy. Their objection isn't to tariffs in principle, it's to this specific set of tariffs aimed at this specific country without any exemptions at what they see as the wrong moment and against the wrong target. Why Canada in particular? The tariffs at the centre of this dispute would touch a wide range of Canadian goods. According to reporting on the union effort, sectors like forestry, including plywood, particle board, veneer, and various paper products, would be squarely in the crosshairs. That matters because a significant chunk of Canada's forestry workforce, estimated in the tens of thousands, is concentrated in small, often remote communities, where those jobs form the backbone of the local economy. Losing that kind of work isn't just an economic hit. In many of these towns, it's the loss of the only stable employment available for miles. On the Canadian side of the USW, leadership has already reported losing between 1,500 and 2,000 members over the past year alone as a direct consequence of the ongoing trade tensions with Washington. Union officials describe an atmosphere of persistent insecurity in Canadian workplaces, driven largely by the unresolved dispute over how the existing USMCA-CUSMA trade agreement should actually be applied and enforced. This isn't the first time labour groups have raised alarms about the legal basis for these tariffs, either. Earlier this year, the IAM wrote to US senators in support of a resolution that would have ended the national emergency declaration Trump used to justify duties on Canadian imports in the first place, a declaration tied to concerns about fentanyl trafficking. In that letter, the union pointed to US Customs and Border Protection data showing that less than 1% of fentanyl seizures at the border come from the northern border with Canada, compared to more than 96% from the southern border with Mexico. Their argument was straightforward. Using fentanyl as the justification for punishing Canada doesn't line up with where the actual problem is happening, a divided labor movement. What makes this story more complicated, and honestly more interesting, is that not everyone in the American labor movement agrees with USW and IM's position. Some rank-and-file steelworkers have become vocal supporters of Trump, specifically because of his tariff policies, believing that aggressive trade action will help restore manufacturing jobs and job security across the industrial Midwest and beyond. A grassroots group calling itself Steelworkers for Trump has built a following of thousands of supporters over the past couple of years, and regularly appears at Trump rallies, championing exactly the kind of hardline trade stance that their own union's national leadership is now trying to walk back. At least when it comes to Canada specifically, the United Auto Workers, one of the largest and most influential unions in the country, has taken a similar pro-tariff stance, viewing the broader tariff push as a means of bringing well-paying, unionized manufacturing jobs back onto US soil, even when that comes at the direct expense of jobs across the border in Canada. So this isn't simply a story of unions versus Trump. It's more nuanced than that. It's a story of union leadership trying to draw a distinction between tariffs that punish genuinely unfair trade practices and tariffs that, in their view, punish a long-time ally for no clear strategic reason, while other segments of the same labor movement see the tariffs as an unambiguous win for American jobs, regardless of the diplomatic cost. Canada isn't staying quiet either. The pushback isn't limited to American labor groups. Major Canadian unions have also spoken out forcefully against the proposed Section 338 tariffs. Unifor, one of Canada's largest private sector unions, issued a statement declaring that the tariffs appear designed to deliberately inflict economic damage on Canadian industry and Canadian workers, rather than to correct any specific unfair trade practice. On the political side, Canadian officials have also been navigating how to respond without escalating tensions further. There's been public discussion in Canada about whether the country should use its energy exports as a point of leverage in trade negotiations with Washington, though Canadian leadership has so far ruled that option out, seemingly preferring a more measured negotiation-first approach rather than an escalatory one. What comes next? For now, the union letter represents an appeal rather than a guarantee of anything. USTR Jameson Greer has not publicly committed to changing course, and the clock is ticking toward the August 19th deadline. If the tariffs go into effect as currently planned, they would mark one of the more aggressive trade actions taken against Canada in recent memory. Notable not just for the size of the tariff, 50% is a steep number, even by the standards of the ongoing trade disputes of the past few years, but for the total absence of exemptions for CUSMA-compliant goods, which had previously served as something of a safety net for cross-border trade even during periods of tension. Whether Greer and the administration take the union's appeal seriously remains to be seen, but the fact that USW and IAM, organizations with real political weight and a track record of supporting many of Trump's other trade moves, felt compelled to draw this particular line, suggests that even within circles generally sympathetic to an aggressive tariff strategy, there's growing concern that targeting Canada, this broadly may do more harm than good, both for Canadian communities bracing for job losses and for American workers whose industries are deeply intertwined with Canadian supply chains. As August 19th approaches, all eyes will be on whether this appeal from organised labour is enough to shift the administration's approach, or whether it becomes another example of a trade policy moving forward despite pushback from groups that might otherwise be considered natural allies.